Chapter 2, Part 1 of Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt. When Thoreau left the university, he was just 20 years old, and the first question which occupied his mind was naturally the choice of a profession by which he might gain his living. Like the other members of his family, he became a teacher, an occupation of which he had, as we have seen, already made trial during his vacations at college. In the spring of 1838, he went on a visit to Maine, where his mother had relatives, on the lookout for some educational appointment, bearing with him testimonials signed by Dr. Ripley, R.W. Emerson, and the president of Harvard University, all of whom spoke in the highest terms of his intellectual and moral character. He seems, however, to have been unsuccessful in this particular quest, for in the same year we find him engaged with his brother in keeping the Academy at Concord, the private school for boys and girls at which he himself had been educated, and which had been established about 20 years before by some of the leading Concord citizens. How long Thoreau held this post is not precisely recorded, but it is evident that he did not find his tutorial position at all congenial to his tastes. Indeed, it is difficult nowadays to conceive of this champion of individuality discharging the functions of teacher under the supervision of a visiting committee. If we may trust the humorous account given by Ellery Channing of Thoreau's pedagogic experiences, the immediate cause of the resignation of his office was the question of corporal punishment. He at first announced that he should not flog, but should substitute the punishment of talking morals to his pupils. But after a time one of the school committee remonstrated against this novel system, and protested that the welfare of the school was being endangered by the undue leniency of its master. Mr. Thoreau must use the ferule, or the school would spoil. So he did, by feruling 6 of his pupils after school, one of whom was the maid-servant in his own house. But it did not suit well with his conscience, and he reported to the committee that he should no longer keep their school, as they interfered with his arrangements. School-keeping seems to have been practiced by Thoreau for about 2 years in all. Then, as more congenial subjects occupied his attention, he gave it up altogether, and betook himself to his foreordained and inevitable profession, the study of nature. The ferule of the schoolmaster was laid by for the herbarium and spyglass of the poet naturalist. This brings us to the mention of a movement which was gathering force in New England during Thoreau's youth and early manhood, and had a marked influence on the whole development of his character. Transcendentalism, i.e., the study of the pure reason which transcends the finite senses, the feeling of the infinite, as Emerson expressed it, which originated in the philosophy of Kant and was revived by Coleridge and Carlyle in England, had now begun to be a disturbing and regenerating power in American thought, and to find its chief exponents in such men as George Ripley, Alcott, and Emerson. Though there had long before been a vein of native transcendentalist doctrine in the quietism and Quakerism of Penn, John Woolman, and others, this transcendentalism of New England was simply a fresh outburst of ideal philosophy. It was a renaissance in religion, morals, art, and politics, a period of spiritual questioning and awakening. The transcendental movement, says Lowell, was the Protestant spirit of Puritanism seeking a new outlet and an escape from forms and creeds which compressed rather than expressed it. The apostles of the newness, or realists, as the transcendentalists were variously styled, aimed at a return from conventionality to nature, from artifice to simplicity. They held that every one should not only think for himself, but should labor with his own hands, and the exaltation of the individual as opposed to the state and the territorial immensity of America was one of their most cherished purposes. It was not to be expected that this transcendentalist revival, which by its very nature was vague, misty, and ill-defined, would be exempt from the extravagances and absurdities which almost inevitably accompany such a movement. But if certain members of the transcendentalist party were deservedly the butt for a good deal of ridicule, the main purpose of the movement was too important to be laughed down, and fully justified itself in the light of subsequent events. Originating in the meetings of a few friends, of whom Emerson was one, at George Ripley's house in Boston, this New England transcendentalism proved to be one of the most powerful forces in American literature and politics. Concord, where Thoreau was born and bred, became, as we shall see, one of the centers of the transcendental movement, which aimed at carrying its doctrines into every branch of social life. It is not surprising, therefore, that a mind already naturally predisposed to idealism should have been strongly affected by the congenial gospel of an inner intellectual awakening. His diaries, poems, and early letters are full of this transcendental tone, and it was doubtless in great part owing to the same influence that he felt so marked a disinclination to settle down in the ordinary groove of business. It was not only school-keeping that was given up by Thoreau under the stress of this new faith. In 1838, or thereabouts, while he was still a school-teacher, he had quietly but definitely seceded from Dr. Ripley's congregation, to the grief and disappointment, it must be feared, of the venerable pastor, who looked with suspicion and alarm on the gospel of the transcendentalists, which he saw promulgated all around him towards the close of his long career. The youthful secessionist had moreover run the risk of imprisonment by his refusal to pay the church tax, on the ground that he did not see why the schoolmaster should support the priest more than the priest the schoolmaster. The difficulty was finally settled by his signing a statement in which he testified that he was not a member of any congregational body, that so fearless and independent a thinker as Thoreau should maintain his adherence to any religious formula was not to be expected, for the very reason that the natural piety of his mind was so simple and sincere. If a name be sought for the faith which he henceforth held and practiced, he should probably be styled a pantheist. Never was there a more passionately devout worshipper of the beauty and holiness of life, and it was on this instinctive belief in the eternal goodness of nature that he based the optimistic creed which we shall find to be the central point of his philosophy. School-keeping being abandoned, the question of a profession, it may well be supposed, was still pressed on the youthful enthusiast by anxious relatives and friends. As we have already seen, pencil-making was the regular employment of the Thoreau family, and Henry, like his father, had acquired much skill in this handicraft, to which, for a time at any rate, he applied himself with great diligence. Mr. John Thoreau's secret consisted in his process for making the lead. The levigated plumbago was made into a paste by using fuller's earth and water. This ingredient was John Thoreau's device. The paste was rolled into sheets, cut into strips, and burned. Henry Thoreau made the levigated plumbago long after the pencil-making had ceased. The story goes that when he had entirely mastered the secrets of the trade, had obtained certificates from the recognized connoisseurs in Boston of the excellence of his workmanship, and was being congratulated by his friends on having now secured his way to fortune, he suddenly declared his intention of making not another pencil, since he would not do again what he had done once. True or not, the anecdote is happily characteristic of Thoreau's whimsical manner of expressing his most serious convictions. He had early discovered, by virtue of that keen insight which looked through the outer husk of conventionality, that what is called profit in the bustle of commercial life is often far from being, in the true sense, profitable, that the just claims of leisure are fully as important as the just claims of business, and that the surest way of becoming rich is to need little. In his own words, a man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone. This being so, why should he, at the outset of his career, pledge himself irrevocably, after the manner of young men, to some professional treadmill, and for the sake of imaginary comforts sacrifice the substantial happiness of life? No, no, he exclaims, at a later period, in reply to a well-meant suggestion that, being without a definite profession, he should engage in some commercial enterprise. I am not without employment at this stage of the voyage. To tell the truth, I saw an advertisement for able-bodied seamen when I was a boy, sauntering in my native port, and as soon as I came of age I embarked. This enterprise was none other than the study of wild nature. His business was to be a professional walker, or saunterer, as he called it, to spend at least one half of each day in the open air, to watch the dawns and the sunsets, to carry express what was in the wind, to secure the latest news from forest and hilltop, and to be self-appointed inspector of snowstorms and rainstorms. These duties he subsequently declared that he had faithfully and regularly performed. If his friends were disappointed, he at least was not. Witness his own lines in his prayer. Great God, I ask thee for no meaner pelf than that I may not disappoint myself, that in my action I may soar as high as I can now discern with this clear eye, and next in value which thy kindness lends, that I may greatly disappoint my friends. Howe'er they think or hope that it may be, they may not dream how thou'st distinguished me. Idleness, however, formed no part of Thoreau's loitering. He was not one who would permit himself to be dependent on the labor of others, for he was well aware that one of the most significant questions as to a man's life is how he gets his living, what proportion of his daily bread he earns by day labor or job work with his pen, what he inherits, what steals. Apart from the chosen occupation of his lifetime, to which he devoted himself with unflagging industry and zeal, he conscientiously supported himself by such occasional labor as his position required, toiling from time to time, to quote an illustration which he was fond of using, like Apollo in the service of Admetus. During the first 10 years of his mature life, that is, from 1837 to 1847, he earned what little he needed chiefly by manual work, his remarkable mechanical skill enabling him to do this with readiness. At the family business of pencil making, in spite of his reported youthful abjuration, he worked at intervals during the greater portion of his life, chiefly by way of rendering aid to his father and sisters. Land surveying was another employment in which he incidentally busied himself, and here too, owing to his adroitness in mensuration, and his intimate acquaintance with the Concord hillsides and woodlots, his services were highly valued. He also began at this time, though but slightly and tentatively at first, to give his attention to lecturing and literary work. His first lecture, the subject of which was society, was delivered in April 1838 at the Concord Lyceum, where he afterwards lectured almost every year during the remainder of his life. His earliest poems were composed about 1837. While in residence at Harvard University, he had been a constant reader of verse, had mastered Chalmers' collection, and become acquainted with a quaint and old-fashioned school of poetry little known to his neighbors and contemporaries. The influence of Herbert, who was one of his early favorites, is very discernible in Thoreau's youthful poems, and Cowley, Davenant, and Donne were most attentively studied by him, Quarles also at a somewhat later period. One of the most remarkable of these early poems is the piece entitled Sic Vita, of which the first stanza runs thus: I am a parcel of vain strivings tied by a chance bond together, dangling this way and that, their links were made so loose and wide, methinks for milder weather. This poem was written on a strip of paper which bound together a bunch of violets, and so thrown in by Thoreau at the window of Mrs. Brown of Plymouth, a lady with whom he corresponded, and who was the means, as will be related, of his being introduced to Emerson. In 1837, a strong stimulus was given to his prose writing by the commencement of a regular series of diaries, the first of which, the Red Journal, ran on to some 600 long pages in less than 3 years. Here he systematically noted his daily walks, adventures, and meditations, so that as the diary was revised and corrected with considerable minuteness, its author was able to draw direct from this literary store whenever he needed the materials for a poem or essay. This was the case with his contributions to the Dial, when that transcendentalist organ was started in 1840 by certain of Thoreau's friends. At this time, there were living in the Thoreau's house at Concord a Mrs. Ward, widow of Colonel Joseph Ward, an officer who distinguished himself in the War of Independence, and their daughter, Miss Prudence Ward, who was referred to in an early passage of Thoreau's first volume, The Week, as the friend to whom the two voyagers sent news of the whereabouts of the rare hibiscus. The Wards and the Thoreaus had been old friends in Boston when both families were living there, and Mrs. and Miss Ward had come to Concord in 1833, living first with Henry Thoreau's aunts, Jane and Maria Thoreau, and afterwards at the house of his father. This led to an incident which must have affected Thoreau very deeply at the time, and may possibly furnish a key to some otherwise obscure traits in his writings. His love for the girl to whom his brother John is also said to have been attached. This was Ellen Sewall, a granddaughter of Mrs. Ward, and daughter of the Reverend E. Sewall, pastor of Scituate. Her brother, then a boy of 11, was at school at Concord under John and Henry Thoreau, and Ellen, a beautiful girl of 17, used to visit the Thoreaus in order to be near her relatives. These visits were much enjoyed by all the party, as the 4 younger members of the Thoreau household were then at home, and many hours were pleasantly spent in long country walks or boating excursions, or in reading aloud and discussing, according to a custom then popular in Concord, some book in which they were interested. Hence it happened that the 2 brothers fell in love with Miss Sewall, and the story has been told that Henry, in a rare spirit of self-sacrifice, abstained from urging his own claims so as to avoid placing himself in any rivalry with his brother. There is, however, no reason to believe that the girl felt anything more than friendship for either of them, and shortly after John Thoreau's death she married the man of her choice, a clergyman with whom she lived happily to a good old age. Thoreau's elegiac stanzas, published in the Dial in 1840 under the title of Sympathy, are said, on Emerson's authority, to contain a reference, under a thin disguise, to his love for Ellen Sewall, the gentle boy of the poem being in truth a gentle girl. But according to another statement, the verses were dedicated to her brother, a boy of great promise and most lovable disposition, who bore a strong likeness to his sister. At any rate, it seems probable that Ellen Sewall was to some extent in Thoreau's mind when he wrote the poem Sympathy, and it is said that certain sonnets which he addressed to her will some day see the light. It is to be regretted that, from a false notion of propriety, such extreme reticence has so long been maintained concerning the story of Thoreau's love, and that facts which have much interest for his readers, and can cause no pain to his survivors, should even now be very imperfectly known. Lately, alas, I knew a gentle boy, whose features all were cast in virtue's mould, as one she had designed for beauty's toy, but after manned him for her own stronghold. So I was taken unawares by this, I quite forgot my homage to confess. Yet now am forced to know, though hard it is, I might have loved him had I loved him less. Each moment as we nearer drew to each, a stern respect withheld us further yet, so that we seemed beyond each other's reach, and less acquainted than when first we met. Eternity may not the chance repeat, but I must tread my single way alone, in sad remembrance that we once did meet, and know that bliss irrevocably gone. To those who are acquainted with even the outline of this story of Thoreau's youthful passion, it becomes less difficult to understand the somewhat severe and remotely ideal tone that pervades his utterances on friendship and love. In the light of this new fact, says Mr. R. L. Stevenson in his essay on Thoreau, those pages, so seemingly cold, are seen to be alive with feeling. In this relation, we see that there is a peculiar appropriateness in the title which Emerson first applied to Thoreau, the Bachelor of Nature. End of Chapter 2, Part 1.